Welcome back to AM 950 Radio, the progressive voice of Minnesota, for another episode of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for joining me on the radio or on your favorite podcast app. If you'd like to comment on the show or have a question about the show, send it to comment@am950radio.com. So actually, today I'm going to be answering a couple of questions from listeners. I got, after the second show, some people had some questions about that, so part of the show is going to be answering those two questions. So last week I talked about three of the main reasons why we have a government. One was liberty or freedom, the second one was maintaining order, and the third one was justice or equality, and how they clash with each other. Part of our politics is debating about how we should have each of these, how much we should have of each of these, and trying to find a proper balance on that. So last week, after last week's show, somebody asked me if there are some examples that I could give of how those three main purposes of government have shown up in our political history or some of the past documents that involve politics. So that's what this section is going to be. So, Brett, I have a question for you.
All right, shoot it. What do we got?
Do you know what the Mayflower Compact is?
Vaguely, as I go back to my grade school days, learning a little bit about it, but I believe that was from the Mayflower originally back in, the 17th century, and it had something to do with, setting their own rules or governance, correct?
Yep. This is the Mayflower Compact, which was written in 1620. Is kind of referred to by historians and political scientists as one of the first examples of how the people, like in this case the pilgrims on the Mayflower ship, formed their own government. And they actually wrote it down. So if you want to, I'm going to be paraphrasing it a little bit here, but if you just Google Mayflower Compact, you can see it. It's a pretty short document. But essentially what happened there was the people on the Mayflower ship, they were roughly around 100 people or so. They were coming from England. They didn't like the Church of England, so they were coming over to America to, for mainly religious reasons, like a lot of the pilgrims did at that time. So they had gotten plans and made agreements for these people to go to the Virginia area. At that time it was Virginia, where it was just off the Hudson River, which was kind of north of the Jamestown colony. So that's where they were originally supposed to go to. But while they were trying to get there, they ran into some bad weather. Bad enough where they were blown off course, and bad enough where the captain said, we can't go to where we want to anymore, so I'm going to land you somewhere else. So they went around Cape Cod area, and that's where they ended up landing. And the captain of the Mayflower ship decided, I can't go where we're going to go, so where we wanted to go, so this is where we're going. And since the original charter that the people had was going to be in a different place, some of those people said, well, we're not going to abide by this agreement anymore. We're going to do our own thing when we hit land. Good luck. So, of course, there were some arguments on the ships about what they're going to do, and they end up coming up with an agreement, which is what the Mayflower Compact is. So when they hit land, they abided by this compact. So I'm going to paraphrase it here a little bit. So what they agreed to do as a group, a society, if you will, of the people that were on the ships, they agreed to combine together as a civil body politic, as they called it, for their order and preservation. So basically what they did here is they agreed to form a government. And they agreed that the government could make just and equal laws for the betterment of the colony, unto which they promised to obey. In other words, they agreed to obey the laws that was made by the government, which the people chose as who was going to be on the government. And all of the men signed onto this agreement. Since the women had no power back then, just the men signed it. So that's basically what the Mayflower Compact is. And this is an example of popular sovereignty where the people form their own government. This isn't, a king or anything that is ruling over them. And it's also an example of a social contract where the people agree to form their own government and that they agree to follow the laws that the government makes. So again, this Mayflower Compact is one of the earliest examples in America. And it also incorporates the 3 reasons for government in it. They use their liberty, first of all, to agree to form the government. They voluntarily agreed to do this. And they also agreed to follow the laws. So by agreeing to follow the laws, they also agreed to give up some of their liberty, depending on what the laws were. Order comes into play. Right out of the compact, they talk about that they're doing this for their order and preservation. Back then, if a lot of the settlers, when they first came over, a lot of them died off because they didn't have order. They weren't able to, preserve their colonies. So that's where order comes into play, is they agreed that they would do this to maintain order in their colony and preserve it, because they probably wouldn't have lasted very long if they didn't have a government. So also by promising to obey the laws, they're helping to maintain order in their little society. Finally, they said that the government could make just and equal laws, which is the 3rd reason for having a government, justice or equality. So they said that the government should make just and equal laws. And again, that they agreed to follow them. So they're agreeing to follow just and equal laws here. So this is an example of those 3 main reasons to have a government. So the Mayflower Compact is generally regarded as one of the first ones in America. Another famous example of these 3 reasons is, of course, the preamble to the United States Constitution. I'll be talking about the Constitution many times in future shows, but many of you probably learned the preamble by, I did, by a schoolhouse rock song where they did it. So I'm just going to read it here for you and see if you can figure out where liberty and freedom, maintaining order, and justice and equality show up. Again, this is pretty short. So it says, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty, posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution, United States of America." It's all one line in it. But you heard some of the words, some of these 3 reasons, right? Or right in the preamble here. So notice here that they're saying "we the people of the United States." It's not saying "we the states of the United States." That's kind of an important distinction, as I'll talk about in a future show. But it says "we the people of the United States." So here again, liberty shows up where people are agreeing to this Constitution. And then it goes on, in order to form a more perfect union. So that has equality and justice in it. They want to make a more perfect union. In other words, they want to make, at that time, the 13 colonies or 13 states to join together to form a better place for themselves, right? Next one, this is an easy part, establish justice. So they just come out and say, establish justice. So this is the justice and equality part. Ensuring domestic tranquility and providing for the common defense. These 2 both deal with maintaining order. Okay, now that the United States is a new country, we need to have a national army to protect us from foreign invaders or internal strife, which relates to the domestic tranquility part. If you want to Google Shays' Rebellion, that's one of the reasons why the Constitution was formed, was because there was some internal strife between the colonists themselves. And Shays' Rebellion was one which kind of showed the Founding Fathers that, hey, the Articles of Confederation which was the previous form of government, wasn't really working very well. And that was one of the reasons why, it was because there was some internal strife and it nearly came to us firing on each other at that point. So not surprising that order shows up in here. Promoting a general welfare, this is has to do with equality again and making things better for the people. Securing the blessings of liberty, so there's that word there, not only for them but for future generations, right? So those are some examples of those three reasons to have a government that are right in the preamble to the Constitution. And one of the main things about the Constitution, remember, is they're trying to do this for the betterment of everybody, not just certain groups, but for everybody. So that's, where the justice and equality come in as well. So those are the Mayflower Compact and the Constitution are a couple of examples. Another one is the Declaration of Independence. I'll be talking about that document in a future show as well. So I'm going to be just kind of pointing out some places in the Declaration of Independence where some of these things show up. So, Brett, I got a question for you.
All right, I'm ready for another.
Have you read the...
Like I could tell you excerpts, but probably not like the entire document where I've sat down and read the entire thing. And, as you mentioned, I probably should have. But I do know my bits and pieces of it, though.
Yeah. That's one of the things I have my students do in my classes is to read the Declaration of Independence and also read the Constitution itself. Because a lot of people don't. I mean, they've heard of it, like you have, and, know some bits and pieces of it. But I invite you to read them. And I'll be talking about them, in more detail later. But, of course, one of the things in the Declaration as well, people can change governments and declare their independence. I mean, that's what they basically did here, right, in this document. So this is an example of, their liberty and freedom. It's like, okay, we're deciding as a group that we are no longer going to be a colony of England. We're going to be our own country. So this is the example of how, they're using their to break off from England. Another spot is where, this is maybe, Brett, this might be the more famous ones. It's so famous, I think, that some of my students think that line is actually in the Constitution. But it's this. And, they say that all created equal in that quote, too. So there's an example of that as well. Declaration of Independence. It did say life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, not the pursuit of happiness. So the Founding Fathers were big into private property rights protection, which is also part of order, maintaining order. So it goes further on about, it talks about the consent of the people, is needed to do this. So that's an example of liberty and freedom. There's some passages in there about just powers, which deals with justice. The consent of the governed. So that's the liberty aspect again. Speaking is mentioned in there. That part is about order. Declaring, themselves independent. That's liberty, as well as they were having lots of fights with British troops at that point already by that time. So it dealt with trying to have order as well. There's a laundry list in there. They are unfit to rule over free people, so that's where liberty and justice come in. All right, so these are some examples of the three main purposes of government being involved in the Declaration of Independence. So, again, you're listening to the Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you. I'll be back talking about the media.
1, 2, 3. It's all part of my fantasy. I love the music and I love to see the crowd dancing in the aisle.
Welcome back to AM 950 Radio, the progressive voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch, on the Politics Matter show. Coming back for a second segment now. Thanks for being with me today. If you'd like to comment on the show, send an email or a question to comment@am950radio.com. By the way, the next segment that I'm going to do, I'm going to be answering a listener question about the Supreme Court, so stay tuned for that. So there's lots of things going on in politics recently, like the presidential election campaign, some Democrats wanting Biden to drop out, the shooting of Donald Trump, and, of course, the Republican National Convention that's going on right now. Well, these are legitimate news stories. I want to spend some time talking about media coverage in this country and how it is failing us when it comes to political coverage. And by doing so, they are helping give a platform to those who want to end democracy. So I don't think the media has learned a whole lot since the 2016 election, and it looks like they're going, through this election, making the same mistakes they did in 2016. So the first example I'm going to use is use the should Biden step aside issue that's out there. Well, some in the press were reporting on this periodically, and Dean Phillips challenged Joe Biden in the primary. One of the things he talked about was Biden's age, right? But Biden easily won the primaries. But after that debate performance, which admittedly was pretty bad, the floodgates opened and the press came on, after this was June 27th, so it's been 3-4 weeks now, and they're still talking about it. So the media jumps all over this and says Biden should just drop out because of this one bad night in a debate. By the way, if you pay attention to the debate rules or the debate format, they're pretty bad. It's hard to do any debating when you have a minute or 2 minutes to talk about stuff. But that's a whole nother issue. But since that debate, they're all over Biden about his age and about his gaffes and that kind of thing. But what you're not seeing are any articles about how this debate performance is actually affecting how he is doing his job as president. Isn't that the more important issue? Not his gaffes, but how is he actually doing the job as president? You're not seeing any coverage about that. He's performing his job just fine. He just hosted a NATO summit and got more support for Ukraine. But what do we hear from the press? Well, he made some more verbal gaffes when he was, talking, summarizing the summit. Oh my God. Well, big deal. Again, it's not affecting how he is performing his job. But you wouldn't know that if you're listening to the press coverage. Meanwhile, the press is reporting this with the usual Democrats are not united angle over and over again, day after day now for 3 to 4 weeks. They're rolling out one of the couple dozen, again, it's only a couple dozen Democrats calling for Biden to step down. And the media is presenting it like this is the majority view, when it's actually not. It's just a couple dozen. But you wouldn't know that if you read all these articles or listened to the reports that the media is putting out. This is what the media does, pound away relentlessly on negative stories about Democrats. Well, you might ask, well, why are they doing this? Because they want higher ratings and they want to make money. That's what the media is all about. It didn't used to be. Back in, when I was growing up, the news was not a profit-making venture for the TV or radio stations. But they are now. That's a big change that has been made. And they're doing this because they want ratings, they want money. And they know that bashing Democrats helps with that. Why isn't the press doing the same amount of stories, or more, in my opinion, on Trump's age? He's only 3 years younger than Biden. You don't hear a whole lot of stories about Trump's age. Not week after week after week, day after day after day like they are with Biden. What about Trump's gaffes at his rallies? He makes more errors than Biden does, talks incoherently. But you wouldn't know it from the news stories coming from the press. Have you listened to a Trump rally lately? He's talking about sharks and electric batteries and Hannibal Lecter. I mean, all kinds of weird stuff. The man is incoherent, but the press isn't covering this. They're just giving him a pass again like they did in 2016. When you compare it to the negative Biden coverage, you know, there's no question that there's more Biden stories than Trump stories. What about all the lies Trump said during the debate? You know, there were about 30 some lies that he said during that debate. You know, the press mentioned it for a day or two, and then it's gone. You know, enough for them to say, well, you know, we mentioned it, but it's not the daily attacks like that's going on with Biden. Even though Trump literally lied 30 times. You don't hear anything from the press about it anymore. That's because the media does not cover Republicans like they do Democrats. It really is that simple. Here's another thing about the press. We had 4 years of a Trump presidency. Why isn't the press writing about Trump's actual performance on the job? You're not hearing the press report about that now. About the only thing that Trump did was sign a tax cut in 2017 that favored the rich people and put the rest of us further in debt as a country. And not to mention, you know, all the things related to COVID and how he messed that up miserably. But we just get crickets from the media now about this stuff, about what he did in his 4 years. Nobody's comparing what he did in his 4 years to what Biden's doing in his nearly 4 years now. Why aren't the media doing that? If you really want to inform the people so that they make an informed decision on the election, why don't you do this, media? It's not that hard. The bigger story should be Trump's unfitness for office, starting with his attempt to overturn the 2020 election results, culminating in the insurrection on January 6th. He is now a convicted felon 34 times over. He has been adjudicated in a civil case as a rapist. He claims he knows nothing about Project 2025, the radical Republican plan to dismantle democracy, even though he has mentioned it approvingly before, and many of the authors of this plan were in his administration. He has said he will imprison his political enemies and deport millions of people. By the way, media, you should be paying attention to that some more. He's said he's going to imprison his political enemies. Do you think you, the members of the press, are going to be immune to that? Maybe that's why you're not going after him so much. You're afraid of what he might do to you if you came out against him. Why aren't you reporting on, well, what would happen to our economy if he deported 11 million people like he says he's going to do? Nothing about that. What about his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein? There's been some new stuff that came out recently about that, but hardly any coverage in the press about it anymore. Barely a mention. But when Biden has some gaffes and some speeches, the roof is caving in, according to the media. And if you look at, where this stuff appears, this anti-Biden stuff is on the front page stories with these huge headlines. While the Trump stories, if they even bother to do them, are buried in, the back of the paper, doing a one-off and moving on to bashing Biden some more, day after day after day. So if the average person keeps reading this nonstop negative coverage of Biden and barely a mention of Trump, is it really a surprise that Biden's numbers aren't all that high? Not really. This is something that the Republicans do all the time. And the press lets them do it. They let the Republicans come on and just lie, like literally lie. And they just repeat them over and over and over on all the shows they go on and all the times they're interviewed and all the stuff they write in the newspapers. And the average person, after they see it over and over and over again, they start to believe it. At least some of the people start to believe it. And the press just lets them do it by repeating this stuff over and over and over. Why, media? Aren't you doing the same thing with Trump? The media likes to proclaim that it's just reporting the news. However, let's be clear here. The media is choosing what they cover and choosing how they cover it, which influences the average person, the consumer of the news. So it's far from just reporting the news. They are choosing what they cover. So by doing that, they're choosing what the people should know about. And then how they cover it. So right now they're letting just Republicans do whatever they want, and then they're bashing the Democrats. It's almost like that the media is now in a competition to outdo each other with the Biden should step down articles. To the point that the media is trying to get the people to panic and get Democrats to, well, Biden might not win. What should we do? Now you hear all that stuff going on right now. Again, they're doing this to get money and ratings. Not surprising that they're doing this. Don't fall for this, people. The main argument against Biden isn't that he can't govern. What he has accomplished thus far has been pretty remarkable, given the narrow margins he had the first 2 years, and then now with the Republicans in charge of the House. The main argument against him is, well, he's not going to win the election. Here again, this is the wrong focus. The focus should be on, can he govern or not? The voters decide the election. Right? You and me, don't listen to what the media is doing here. Right now, the media seems to be campaigning hard for a Democratic loss in November again by looking what they're putting out there. Don't let them succeed. We need to put on our critical thinking hats and not fall for all this negativism that's being put out by the press. Just go vote and get your friends to vote and get your neighbors to vote. This election for president will come down simply to this. If you believe in democracy, vote for whoever the Democratic candidate is. If you want to get rid of democracy, vote for Trump. You can also say the same thing about down ballot races. So one of the things about, it's important to vote for president, obviously, but don't forget to vote for all the other down ballot races for Democrats. If you want to get things done, that's what you're going to have to do. Another problem with the media is their obsession with doing both sidesism, meaning their false equivalency between the two parties and candidates in their coverage. An example of this is the coverage after the Trump shooting. The press lets the Republicans come out and lie about how Biden did this and how the Democrats are responsible for this. Then they make their both sides comments, and they say, oh, both sides need to, tone things down. Sorry, that doesn't work. The Democrats are not going around calling for violence like many Republicans are, like Trump himself is. The Democrats are not responsible for this. Yet the press just lets the Republicans say it, and then they throw out the both sides do it comments. Only one side is using this rhetoric, the Republicans. They are the party that won't pass common sense gun laws or do anything when the leading cause of death of children in the United States is gun violence. Only one party poses with guns on their Christmas cards. Only one party tried to overthrow the government on January 6th with violence. Only one party wears AR-15 lapel pins. Only one party just nominated a guy who wants to be a dictator if he wins. But you wouldn't know that by watching the media coverage on this. What the press is doing to the Democrats is called a negative bias, which is a tendency to focus on negative things occurring in the press's mind, as opposed to covering the good things that happen with government. Unfortunately, as I mentioned before, negativity sells in the media, so they're just going to keep doing this. By covering issues in a negative light, It eats away at people's belief in our government and democracy itself. Why not bring more coverage to the positive things Biden and the Democrats did when they were in power, especially the first 2 years when the Democrats controlled the House, the Senate, and the presidency? They got a lot of good things done. Do you hear the press saying anything about that right now? No. Show how democracy can work. Work for the people. Instead of giving free airtime to a party that lies all the time and just nominated a dictator. Why are you doing this in the media? Well, part of it is certainly lazy journalism in action. It is much easier to criticize things than to try and be a part of the solution. Let's not forget that 6 companies own most of the media in the United States. Guess who all of the heads of those companies gave money to? Donald Trump's campaign. Coincidence? I don't think so. So for our next segment, I'm going to answer a listener question involving the Supreme Court. So stay tuned for that. Welcome back to Politics Matters with Bruce Klopfleisch. How civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950 Radio, the progressive voice of Minnesota. You can comment on the show by sending an email to comment@am950radio.com, or you can send in a question. So for this final segment of this week's show, I'm going to answer a listener question. So here's the question. Can the president use an executive order to add justices to the Supreme Court, or does it need Congress's approval to add justices to the court? So thanks for the question. Here's my short answer to the question. I think that Congress needs to pass a bill to increase, or for that matter, decrease, the size of the Supreme Court, and then the president can sign off on the bill, making it a law. I don't think the president can do it by executive order by himself. But, given the recent Supreme Court decision on presidential immunity, who knows? If a Republican president tried it with an executive order, it wouldn't surprise me if the current Supreme Court let him do it, since there's, the 6 Republicans on the court, as I mentioned before. If Biden tried it, it wouldn't surprise me if the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. So I'm going to talk about the Constitution here a little bit and what executive orders are, and give you the reasoning for my decision here. So, Article 3 of the Constitution deals with the judicial branch. Section 1 of Article 3 says that the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. Okay, so based on that part of the Constitution, this is where the Supreme Court, came about, because this part says, well, we have one Supreme Court, but it also gives Congress powers to set up the rest of the federal court system. Remember that the Constitution deals with the federal government, not your state governments. So your state governments set up your state court system, but here we're talking about the federal court system. So it doesn't say in what I read there, it doesn't say that Congress can set up the number of justices on the Supreme Court. Okay? But there is a part of the Constitution, I think, that comes into play here that allows Congress to do that. So this is known as the Necessary and Proper Clause in the Constitution. Some people also call it the Elastics Clause. This appears in Article 1, which is the legislative branch layout in the Constitution. It's in Section 8, Clause 18. So this is the section where the Constitution lays out the express powers of Congress. And this last one says that Congress can make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, in other words, the foregoing 17 other clauses that preceded this. And it also says, and all other powers vested by this Constitution. Okay, so this also could include the judicial branch, right? That's part of the Constitution in Article 3. So by the necessary and proper clause, it seems like Congress is the one that is supposed to set the size of the Supreme Court. Plus, history has shown us this as well. Congress has used this power before to set the number of seats on the Supreme Court. In 1789, this is the first Congress, after the Constitution was ratified, they passed the Judiciary Act, which set up the first Supreme Court. At that time, they set it up to be 6 people on the Supreme Court, because at that time, they set up 6 federal circuit court areas. So they had 6 people on the Supreme Court, 1 Chief Justice and 5 Associate Justices. So this is what the country started out with after the Constitution, was 6. In 1807, Congress made it 7 because they added another judicial district. So at that time we had 7. So they added another justice onto the Supreme Court. In 1837, Congress made it 9 because they added 2 more federal court judicial districts here. This is a time when our country is growing, right? The land, there's getting more land, more population, right? So Congress is adding to the Supreme Court than what it was at 1789 initially. During the Civil War in 1863, Congress pushed it up to 10. Now, we didn't have 10 federal judicial districts at that time. It still had 9, but they pushed it up to 10. And then in 1869, Congress reduced it back to 9, where it stands today. So even though we have 13 judicial districts now in the federal court system, we have 9 Supreme Court justices. So we have not changed, or we being Congress, has not changed the size of the Supreme Court for the last 155 years. Now, you can certainly question whether they should or not, and I think that's one of the things that you're hearing by the people who are advocating that we should raise the size of the Supreme Court, is we haven't done it for 155 years. And the country is a heck of a lot bigger now. There's a lot more cases in court, etc., since then, so we need to do something. So if you go by our history, Congress is the one that needs to pass a bill, and the president signs it into law, and that can change the size of the Supreme Court. So some Democrats have recently proposed raising the court to 13, since there's 13 federal judicial districts today, among other reasons. So that proposal at least is out there. I don't think it's going to go anywhere at the present time, given the numbers in the House and in the Senate, but it's out there. It's certainly going to be a issue in the campaign coming up for the election. As for an executive order by the president by itself, I don't think that will legally work. The presidential power to issue an executive order is not in the Constitution, but past Supreme Court decisions have allowed them, or sometimes they have found them unconstitutional, saying that the president doesn't have the power to do it. So this power does exist, but it doesn't show up in the Constitution itself. What the courts have read into the Constitution as well, the president is the head of the executive branch under Article 2 of the Constitution. So being the head of the executive branch, he can make orders that deal with his powers of the executive branch, which is a lot of the federal agencies that are out there. He's the head of all those, right? So he can make certain executive orders about how those things work, since he's in charge of them. So a lot of the executive orders deal with those sorts of things. So the president can issue these executive orders, but the courts can throw it out if it doesn't look like it comports to his powers under Article 2. So I don't think that trying to expand the Supreme Court deals with his powers under Article 2. It would appear to conflict with Congress's powers under Article 1 that I mentioned before, and also under Article 3 with the judicial branch. Trying to change the size of the Supreme Court you can have some separation of powers arguments there between the presidency and the Supreme Court. But let's just, assume Biden does this. Let's just assume that, right? The courts could say that the executive order is unconstitutional and throw it out. But under our system, Congress can also override a presidential executive order with a majority vote in both the House and the Senate. But if let's say Biden vetoes that bill, if Congress does it, well, Congress can then override the veto with 2/3 in both the House and the Senate. So Congress has the ability, but again, the numbers these days to overcome a veto probably wouldn't have it. But in theory, this does exist. Plus, future presidents can cancel executive orders. So there are some checks and balances on these presidential executive orders. Usually you see the president doing this when Congress isn't doing what he wants. So they try and do it with an executive order. So if, let's say, Biden tries to do this, what would likely happen is somebody would sue. This is what happens a lot these days, is somebody sues when they don't like what the president does or what Congress does. And then the courts decide, ultimately. So, again, I don't think the executive order would work if that's how Biden wants to try and increase the size of the Supreme Court. There has been other news, though, about the Supreme Court. So, you may have heard recently that in the House of Representatives, there's been impeachment resolutions filed against Justices Thomas and Alito, based on some of the things mentioned in the first two shows that I did relating to the failure to recuse themselves, in other words, not hear cases, because of conflicts of interest, and their failure to disclose some financial transactions. So under the Constitution, basically the only way to get rid of federal judges and the presidents, other than elections for the president, but you can't do that with federal judges or justices because they're appointed for life. They don't have any elections to kick them out. So about the only way you can do it is through impeachment. So under the Constitution, impeachment has to start in the House, which is why Representative Ocasio-Cortez filed hers there first. Now, I don't think this is going to happen, right? The House is controlled by the Republicans. They're not going to allow this to come to a vote. And even if they did, they probably have enough votes to, I assume they would all vote no, and it wouldn't pass. But that's the start of the procedure if you are going to try and impeach somebody. This is how the House, the House started the Trump impeachments. And once he was impeached, it went to the Senate, and you couldn't get 2/3 of the Senate to convict Trump, so he stayed in office both times. But I think what's going on here is the Democrats are filing these things to make it a campaign issue, and also to point out that there are concerns now about the lack of accountability on the Supreme Court. But again, given the numbers in the House and the numbers in the Senate, I don't think impeachment will go anywhere. And of course, the justices know this, so they are, pushing the lines to see what they can get away with, I think. So another thing that has happened is that some Democratic members of the the Senate Judiciary Committee referred the Alito and Thomas matters to the Department of Justice, asking for an investigation to see if any of Thomas's and Alito's gifts, in quote, air quotes, violated tax laws. More specifically, looking into whether they failed to disclose income that they should have on their tax forms. I don't know if the Department of Justice is going to do anything. I don't know if Attorney General Garland has the courage to try and do this, even if the facts in the law warrant it. But again, this is another way to highlight what's going on. Finally, President Biden just talked about proposing term limits for Supreme Court justices and a new ethics code for them. Again, this probably won't pass the House, But it's another attempt to bring this into a campaign issue and something that the Democrats need to campaign on. Next week's show, we're going to be talking about Project 2025. So we will talk to you then.